Ross. I'm Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for European Studies at the BUB. And I'd like to welcome you also on behalf of Bart de Scooter, who can't be here tonight, unfortunately, to the third lecture of the lecture series, Europe Under Threat, Security, Migration, Integration. The title of today's two presentations, of the overarching title is Migration and the Ethics of Human Security Technologies. We have two very distinguished and interesting speakers invited tonight who will enlighten us on these issues. The first is Rene von Schomberg, who's a scientific officer at the European Commission, DG Research, Governance and Ethics Unit. And he works specifically on ethics and governance of emerging technologies. His background is rather broad and varied, with degrees in agricultural science, philosophy, and science and technology studies. And he's also been an EU fellow at George Mason University in the United States during 2007. So we're looking forward to that presentation. Okay. And the second speaker tonight is Eddan Kataz. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Who is the International Affairs Director at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a non-profit membership-based organization based in San Francisco, where he's responsible for managing international advocacy, specializing in access to knowledge and digital rights. A note on the procedure: we will hear both presentations in the order in which I introduced the speakers, but we will discuss them individually since Dr. von Schomberg will have to leave a little bit earlier. So after his presentation, we'll open the floor for your questions and comments and discuss the presentation for about 20-30 minutes, and then move on to the second presentation with the same format. So, Dr. von Schomberg, please.
Well, thank you very much, Eva. Thank you very much also for the invitation. I feel a little bit confined behind this microphone. I don't know, because there is some kind of CCTV camera watching me all the time, that they want me to sit in this place. I just come from Manchester, England, and perhaps, as you know, I think on every 3 UK citizens there is one camera around. So I've been photographed quite a lot recently. This is sort of stepping up to the topic, the social and ethical aspects of security technologies. I myself, as Eva mentioned, I'm based in the Governance and Ethics Unit of DG Research, which implements, among other, the Science in Society program, where we have some policy actions in the field and also do research relevant to the science-society interface. I will shortly tell you a little bit about this background, but we'll then go straight into the issue of the ethics of security technologies. I will do it in a way based on sort of research indications, problematizing the ethical issues surrounding security technologies. So I throw up more questions than answers. But perhaps if you prefer that, then that I will try to sell you some kind of biometrics tool for passports or something like that. Because if you want to do that, then you have to get some colleague of mine from Justice Department, I think. So there are, in the program, specifically my own preoccupations are on the research on the ethics of new technologies. So under new technologies, the security technologies, biometrics and so is one of them. We are also engaged in promoting European and international dialogue on sensitive issues. We actually started an international dialogue on the ethics of biometric tools, which both in the US and EU has started to issue passports and visa entry systems using biometric tools. We started with an international dialogue in 2005 here in Brussels. It was a big conference subsequently, we did also a conference in Washington and very soon one in Asia, in Hong Kong. As you probably may understand, when we talk about ethics, there is not something like an ethical legislation in Europe. Obviously, this falls on the subsidiarity principle in the EU. We have also within the EU a huge variety in let's say, social ethical attitudes towards security technologies. As I already mentioned, I just come from the UK, and nobody seems really to bother about all these cameras and all these things around. Whereas in other parts of Europe, this could quite upset particular citizens. So there is quite a variety also within Europe, but also, of course, between the major, let's say, blocks in the world. Between the US and Europe, we have conflicts around this issue, actually, which culminated, among others, perhaps as you have noticed, on the issue of passenger name records, for instance. In Asia, there are again other attitudes towards this issue. So we are actually engaged in trying to promote a dialogue and raise awareness on the issue without prejudicing in which direction the decision making should take place. Thirdly, we support national forums for ethics councils across Europe, and we are occupied with so-called cross-thematic issues, nanotechnologies, for instance, where I'm occupied with, but also security technologies. So we had a particular focus on particular technologies recently. When it comes to security technology, I already mentioned this, especially biometrics. On nanotechnology, we developed a code of conduct. I won't go into that because that's not the topic for today. What I highlight especially is the issue of privacy and security technologies, so the legal, ethical, and social aspects. We had a call in, well, it says the current call, but that's of course a past call, in 2008 for research projects in this field. I have a couple of projects under my management which are now about to start. Some already have been working on the issue. So I will also report a little bit on that. Perhaps the best way to start the whole topic is to brief you a little bit on a couple of scandals when it comes to security and privacy. This is an example of the German supermarket Lidl. Here dubbed in an English newspaper as the Big Brother supermarket, where it is stated as a Stasi secret police may have died with communism, but its surveillance methods have not. Actually, the supermarket chain hired detectives equipped with spectacular security cameras, and although it was meant to protect the store against theft, actually it was used as a surveillance tool of the employers of Lidl. And just to cite some cases which were in the press, so there were, what it says also here, several hundred of pages of surveillance records actually was leaked to Stern magazine, which is a big German boulevard magazine. And as you say, for instance, Mr. G tells Mrs. L that she has never paid a television license fees because he's still registered with her parents, even though she lives with her boyfriend. So the detective made up a report and says that Mr. G is obviously a security risk. Lidl escapes Lidl. Above all, there is a fascination for laboratory behavior. Mrs. R has been leaving to go to the toilet every 50 minutes despite waiting customers, says one report. So it is obviously, this is of course against the law. There's no question about that. So but it happens. Just to continue with some scandals, just to give you a taste of what's going on recently. In Germany, there was as well a big data. Well, sorry for this slide. I actually lost my slides during my trip, and I had to redo a little bit. I couldn't do otherwise than getting back to some of the original documents. One was a big data scandal in Germany involving call centers, which have been used, all kinds of addresses of citizens, actually culminated to 20 million individuals, including Chancellor Merkel, the Bundeskanzlerin of Germany, having an address, telephone number, etc., and they sell these data to companies. Obviously, this is also illegal, but it happens. Another scandal is the German telecom. Again, another example from Germany. I will not focus only on Germany, but it's all over Europe, don't worry. So the German telecom, for instance, this report says that there was a data scandal involved actually 70 million of its customers. But this was just one of the scandals coming after a more bigger scandal in which it became known that 72,000 of its employees were supervised their data on their bank accounts, and all these data were being processed without, of course, the knowledge of the employees. Obviously, this is also against the law, but it happens, and we have to analyze why this is actually possible. But I just want to throw up some examples. I can continue with all kinds of scandals like this. In the UK, a couple of times people from all kinds of offices leave discs in the train, among others, list of people who are suspected from terrorism and this type of thing. So it's just lying around everywhere. In Holland, another example, we had this very nice initiative to have a so-called chip for everybody who wants to use the train. Apparently these chips were very easy to crack, although the authorities said it wasn't the case. But it would imply that the records of individuals in Holland traveling around would be kept 7 years on file, and you would be able to analyze who is moving at what time, at what hour of the day, to which place. This is not necessarily against the law, but there we are already on a sort of problem how to assess that. So these are the scandals. I was based for a while in the US, and I don't want to withhold you this interesting example, because this leads up a little bit on discussing what privacy actually is and how you would be able actually to protect it, or how we could discuss it. And as I mentioned, the cultures are different around the world. For a European, this is rather weird, but I think also for Americans this is not quite usual. In fact, a senator of a Republican conservative senator was arrested at an airport in Minneapolis because in the toilets of that airport there were undercover police people stationed to test whether, I can't put it otherwise, to see whether there are individuals on the toilet inclined to have sex with, and they would do that with foot tapping on the floor. And so if then, there are police guys sitting somewhere in the toilet, he taps his feet underneath to the next door, and then if somebody responds, then okay, you could have sex. But then this is a police agent, so in the case, the senator was actually arrested for this. This goes probably contrary to notions of privacy which we have, apart from the fact that there are also a couple of other issues which you would need to discuss here. But also, this actually happens, and interesting enough, the senator involved actually pleaded guilty. It's actually a strange thing to do. In the meantime, apparently these toilets have become a tourist attraction. So where are we now? Is this now the end of privacy, and does anybody care? Because, well, I mean, you are here in the audience, most of you are probably much younger than me, and I'm aware that especially younger people, when they go on the internet, are less careful with their data, or probably won't mind what all happens with it. So the question, does anybody care, or does our new generation care, comes up, and I look forward to a discussion on that, in fact. But let's then go back to the basics. What is privacy? Would it be the right to be anonymous, for instance? This is a sort of feeling a lot of people would associate with privacy. I think this does actually not cover the concept. Probably in the past we were, as individuals, much less anonymous. We would live in cities and everybody would know each other. We have in modern life been used to big cities in which you can withdraw and live rather anonymously. And suddenly we are confronted with new technology which lifts this all and places back the question, what does this actually mean, privacy? One of the earlier definitions was in fact the right to be left alone. And one of the, we could explore this definition a little bit, and one element of the right to be left alone was associated with our home. The home where you could actually, as a place to be left alone, you would also have the right to withdraw yourself in the house, and around our house, around our home, all kinds of laws have been historically put in place to protect you actually, and to actually enable you to be alone. And as of course everybody is aware, the police cannot simply just enter your house. It's not possible. And you have certain rights to ensure your privacy. But if we look now to the new technologies which are actually now there, then this, I would almost say traditional right, although it's an actual right, is actually completely out of time, because with all the electronic devices we have nowadays in home, we can, on distance, really, this is sort of electronic cloud hanging around the house nowadays, where you can trace all kinds of things, and you are enabled to invade actually in the privacy of individuals without actually, like if the police would invade your house without any legal basis, would of course be against law, but you can easily do this electronic surveillance outside the house without that this would be illegal. So there we have actually one aspect of the problem. One aspect of the problem is namely that our laws, which we had traditionally in place to protect our privacy, don't seem to live up to nowadays circumstances. A little bit further on what privacy actually is, to provoke a discussion on this. Obviously, apart from that there are differences around the world on how we would define privacy, it's of course also historically under change and subject to change. And what you see here are the first photographs taken by X-ray photographs. In German it's Röntgen photograph by the inventor Röntgen, who could not do otherwise than test his first machines on himself and his wife, because this was in those days, about 100 years ago, without any question an invasion in privacy. This is indecent to show a Röntgen photo of yourself. And so he had to do it on himself and his wife. Both actually died from cancer, and apparently the machines were not so safe. It's not clear, but it shows that probably nowadays, if you, I think people will go to preventive medical checks sometimes. They take their lungs or skeleton Bramkins with them and hang them on the wall, and everybody could see them. Nobody associates this with some kind of invasion of privacy. So you can see there is sort of cultural, historical change to what we would define as privacy. So we have some preliminary conclusions on the issue. I think, well, we have to recall that privacy is in the EU a fundamental right still. I mean, it's in the EU Charter, which is linked to the Lisbon Treaty, although I have to say that the UK has managed to claim an opt-out on that. But for, so the whole European Union except the UK, it is a fundamental right. We see also that a cultural shift of defining privacy is possible. It's the example on ranking technology. And new technologies can make traditional rights obsolete, as I mentioned on the example of the house. Now, let me go into the issue of biometrics, because I was asked to address a little bit the ethical issues surrounding issues around migration and or travel or asylum seekers and so on. Biometrics have been introduced actually in the EU first in the so-called EURAC system, which was for asylum seekers. I think it was in the early, around 2000. Welcome. Actually, it was a sort of request from the US on the EU to have biometrics in place to enable a safe, so to enable a higher level of security in the US, especially after the 9/11 attacks. Perhaps paradoxically, the EU had implemented biometrics in its passports earlier than the US, because in the US they were not enabled to enforce it on their own citizens, rather they would prefer to have it only for the visitors. The story, of course, goes on because the request is now turned the other way around, that the US would apply the same standards as the US requires from EU citizens, but this is again an open question. So we'll see a sort of ongoing thing, this drags on. We made, our department, I was involved in that, made a visit to the US to the DHS, that stands for the Department of Home Security, in November 2006. And we were reported on the outcome of the so-called visitors system, where biometrics was used in those days. Well, it's just a few years ago, still with 2 fingerprints. In the meantime, it has become 10, as also in the EU is required very soon. And since January 2004, so till about November 2006, 70 million visitors were captured through biometrics. And Mr. Magni, who I think he is not there anymore, but was a senior official of the Department of Home Security, told us that hits against known terrorist database was known. In fact, it was one individual that had been taken into custody. Nothing was said about what type of threat or who it was. 1,644 were denied entry. And this all against the background that the cost at that moment of time was already exceeding $362 million after it would come up after 5 years after 9/11 to actually $2 billion. So you see that there is an enormous investment. It's just not the US, of course, the EU have made all similar amounts. So you see that there is a huge investment in those technologies. And one of the criteria on implementing, I mean, I guess both in the US and in the EU, is whether those measures are proportionate or not. Actually, in the EU, it's a requirement for any new legislative action whether those things are proportionate. Is it proportionate to invest so much in order to get this type of outcome? So there is also a report to the Congress. So the price tag is spiraling up. That's the same as in the EU, and there was no meaningful exit capacity. So that means there was no at that time. Although in the meantime they have been working on that in the EU, we have the similar the situation that the officers do know when people come in, but don't know when they go out. So one of the issues one of the issues actually which is debated at the European level is whether a central database is or should be used to against the background of implementing those biometrics. And some have argued for that such a central database is necessary. Others have argued that it should not be done because in our law legally it's not allowed to use the database for more than one single purpose. So if the purpose is for identifying individuals at the border, we are not supposed to use those databases for instance, criminal investigations or something like that. That would be against the law. Nonetheless, if you would have such a central database, obviously the temptation for using this database for other purposes is there. There has been some controversy around it. We'll say a little bit later more about it. And in the meantime, I think it's just the Netherlands who recently implemented it in its passport with biometrics and actually uses the central database. And not all EU member states agree on that. Some of the what are some of the side effects of this whole system? This is from the New York Times. You see that this type of although the system is sold as well, it becomes more convenient, security checks is more easy, it's more safe, etc. You see that there are discouraging effects coming in. For instance, a major hall orchestra did not perform in New York simply because its 85 members who live in the UK and had to travel to London to the US embassy to get their fingerprints ready. It would accumulate to a total cost of $80,000 actually for this orchestra to move to the US, which didn't then make any sense to perform anymore because the costs were obviously more higher than they would ever receive in performing. So there are some discouragements going from that, and I expect this will also, of course, happen in the EU. If you make a little bit of comparison between the US and the EU situation on the right to privacy, I actually have to say I don't do this just by saying that one or the other is better, but just to show that there are differences of approaches and that it's not clear in which direction actually we have to go forward with. In the US, you can say that the right to privacy is is more or less secured by the Fourth Amendment. Maybe our colleague knows more about that. In the European Union, it's as I mentioned in the EU Charter, it's a fundamental right. It's also in the treaty. It's in a couple of directives referred to. The enforcement is different. The US does not have like the EU has data protection authorities around Europe. Each member state has a data protection authority. We have also in Europe a data protection supervisor. There are differences in terms of consumer data collection. My impression, but this is impression, so I think it's open for discussion. I have the sense that in the US, people are more suspicious about what governments would do with citizens' data rather than let's say, private companies, where in the EU it possibly is the other way around. In the EU, there is an existing right that if your data are collected, that you have the right to correct them, and you have, of course, the right to know that they keep a file on you. But as I said, these are your formal rights. Whether you actually are aware of it is another question. So in terms of marketing, there are opt-out possibilities in the US on having that, whereas in the EU, telemarketing without consent is illegal. But very often an implicit consent is actually made. And just only recently, for instance, in the face of these scandals I was just reporting about, member states are turning into the other way around. That in fact, by marketing, you have to ask for explicit consent. Also, just simply using and handling email, there is some differences. In the EU, it would be a violation of privacy if you are, let's say, you are supervisor in your work or something, will always check what happens in your email. Where in the US, it seems to be seen a little bit more differentiated. There are some problems, I think, when it comes to, perhaps I talk too long. How much time do you have? Okay, that should be enough. I see some people are falling asleep, so I'm getting. As I mentioned, we have European data protection offices in Europe, and they monitor the situation. They also make reports on what happens in member states. They give advices to member states on particular things, but what you see is that member states, I would almost say this, but this is just an observation and what's indicated by our research on it, that member states almost seem to ignore these type of advices. For instance, here, this is just one example on the fact whether to use a central database against the background of biometrics, yes or no. This is a citation from the European Data Protection Supervisor, so advises the EU Council what to do, and there it is stated explicitly, although it's possible for the member states to implement only a verification procedure of biometric data using a centralized database, as it is strictly limited to it in a regulation, this option presents additional risks regarding the protection of personal data, such as the development of further purposes not foreseen in the regulation, or even phishing expeditions into the database, which will be difficult to mitigate. Also, in the context of the passenger names data records, for instance, between the EU-US, you had a similar situation. The European Data Protection Supervisors, many European data protection officers have advised against it. Nonetheless, they have ignored those advices. This is in itself a situation which perhaps needs some reflection. I want just to finish off with some of our institutional tasks we have in our unit, and this relates to the so-called ethical review of research proposals submitted to FP7. And these ethical reviews are to see whether research activities carried out under the framework program are actually in compliance with fundamental ethical principles. We have since FP7, which started in 2007, also a security technologies program, which is awarded with €2 billion in 2013. And in light of those, we increasingly have projects where the data of individuals are being collected. So this has to be approved by relevant ethics committees prior to that these research activities actually can start. So the ethical review applies to all research, so not of course to security, but it includes also security technology research. So we do a screening on privacy issues, the dual use issue, for instance, and the obvious other issues such as intervention in humans and animals. So on the basis of a checklist, we ask proposers to see whether there is some kind of processing of genetic information or personal data in the context of research, whether this research actually involves the tracking of or the observation of people. We don't have questions on what actually the potential societal impact of those technologies are. I mean, we of course cannot limit research with a view on that issue, but that does not mean that we should not worry about it. And these are the issues we try to address in the context of research, and we have just started off with some projects that more or less implicitly I've reported on. I think I've been talking already quite some time, and it would be unfair for my colleague to talk now a little bit too long, so I will conclude with that.
Okay, thanks very much.
Perhaps this is actually interesting to see. This is my because this is a map of surveillance societies around the world. Well, this is the term used by a website, Privacy International, which is a sort of watchdog on the privacy situation. And they use different colors for the level of, let's say, protection of privacy around the world. Light green would be that, because you cannot read it, would imply that there is a consistent, protection of human rights. Well, all over the world you actually don't see this color. What you do see is the color black, which means that there is an endemic surveillance society involved, according to this website. And what's interesting is that, for instance, the UK and the US and dictatorships like China are on the same level.
Doesn't quite come out.
Yeah. No, not bad.
All right.
So I hope this lives up to your expectation. I'm sorry my slides weren't that as I wanted to have them be, but this is what I could do.
Okay, thanks. Are there any questions or comments from this presentation before we move on to the next presentation? Sure.
I have a question concerning the concept-level development, especially in the concept-level for this surveillance mechanisms have been further developed in the case of so-called terrorist threats. And what do you think about the racial profiling in this process? Because, okay, all the people here
Well, this is an important issue what you raise. I think you can look at that two things. I mean, if you would answer your question formally, or let's say from the authorities, probably one could say, well, we have these fundamental rights in place, and among those rights is also that the data protection of individuals. So this right is formally ensured in the EU context, and what you are actually asking and explicitly referring to is to a particular set of data which is in the EU context defined as being sensitive. So the issue of ethnicity, sex, and so on, in the EU context defined as sensitive data, which actually require more protection than, let's say, just the protection of your name or something like that. So legally, informally, the EU requires to do more. This is also why there was a conflict, for instance, an example I used with the US on the passenger name records, because the US was requiring those information, and this would, in the EU context, would fall under sensitive data, which you are not supposed to request without that there is a particular purpose, because you cannot just generally screen people without if there is any suspicion for a particular individual. So formally, actually, this is then also against the law to do that in the European context. So we are not supposed to do that. Of course, I don't know what all happens out there, but in terms of profiling, you do actually run the risk that just because individuals may fit a certain risk profile, you are just by being unfortunately in this category, you are more subject to surveillance than others. That can well be. I must say though that I don't know yet, but maybe others do know about it. I don't know yet from cases in which individuals actually have gone to court to complain about, because as I said, it's against the law. So if these things happen, you could also expect that people would complain for court and that it would be a case. But there has not been a case so far. So,
I just would like to know some more about the European Data Protection Agency, the services. You mentioned they advise the governments, but are they appointed by the government? Are there any famous ones?
Well, in the field, there are some people actually indeed famous. Also, they become famous because of all these scandals, which they, of course, have to respond to. The European Data Protection Supervisor is appointed so at the EU level by members of the Council, and it has an explicit role to advise the European Parliament or the EU, the Council, on legislation. So that they also formally adopt opinions. Some of which I also cited. And the European Data Protection Supervisor is Peter Hustings, so he's based here in Brussels. He's indeed famous. So within this world, and then you have member states. They are also actually required to have these data protection officers. So they are chaired also by individuals, and they look whether there are cases, where the law has been violated. So they monitor the situation. Sometimes they can also enforce certain things, and they can even give fines. But in my perception of the issue, as I mentioned, there has been quite a few scandals around Europe. One would almost think that particular companies actually don't care about this so much because the fines are not so high. So I mean, then you can say, okay, let's just they just do it if they fine us, so what? So there is still some things to do there.
Thanks very much. I think we move on to the next presentation.
So I'm not sure where the connection problem is, but I should probably start. Yeah, no, it's the right one, which is hearing on there. Oh. There we go. Excellent, thank you.
Can all of you read that?
Not really.
You may have to come closer, I guess.
How do I increase it? There we go. Is that a little better? Well, okay. So let me start then, and I'll just have to be compelling enough for you to pay attention. So I'm actually from a nonprofit organization called the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We're based in San Francisco, but work internationally. We work on issues of digital rights and access to knowledge, innovation in the digital economy. One of the things that we work on is in regards to warrantless wiretapping or surveillance, are in fact engaged in a lawsuit against the United States government on the surveillance of individual citizens outside of what is permitted by law. As it turns out, someone came into our office, said, I work at AT&T, the big phone company, and I've been seeing some suspicious things attaching to this big data center. It turns out that all of the traffic going through was being funneled to a particular box, which is a black box. We don't know much about what's going on in it, and part of what's going on in trial at this point is even getting to the point where there's some compelling to disclose of evidence. So I'm focusing on that aspect of what we do, surveillance, and I thought it would be appropriate in regards to privacy and the issues that were raised in the, just previously. There we go. So I don't want to be, I don't think we should, be just simply. So I was about to say that we shouldn't be down on technology, but and that technology doesn't have its own intentionality, but I may be wrong. Geez.
He doesn't like
Close that quickly.
Hold the fail to
Okay, so.
I think it's
better like that.
Why don't I go through it like that, as you said? Okay, so as I was about to say, I embrace technology. I think it's important to note that we're entering an important stage of development of the global economy, which many are calling the knowledge economy. It's characterized to some extent by the digitally networked environment, everything connected, transactions, communication, all sorts of these things. And I'm actually going to try to focus on events that happened this past week in my talk, and with reference to the stuff, of course, before, and hopefully things that will happen after, but just this past week. So this past week, Vivian Redding, of the Director General of the Information Society, who's now sort of become a spokesperson for the internet economy, the knowledge economy, at least is trying to position herself that way, gave a speech talking about the key to unlocking the potential of the knowledge-based economy. And I think it's important to recognize there's actually a conflict here between certain interests and companies and perspectives on the law that see the best and most efficient network being controlled and monetized and closed, in a sense. And there's a whole other set of momenta, technologies, individual public policy that sees this new digitally networked environment as fundamentally open and needs to be preserved as such. And I think that opposition is definitely here. Wow. So I'll quickly go through them because they're frustrating. So the one way in which you talk about this positive open side of the digitally networked environment is the extent to which there's access to knowledge, I would say, would describe that. And access to knowledge, speaking in the large concept, is the overlap of innovation and development. And I think is a key driver of the knowledge economy. So on the innovation side, I'll argue for the fact that open infrastructure is actually the best way to promote innovation, allow third parties to innovate, allow individuals to connect without any entrance fees, without barriers. The fact that things are done through peer production. For those of you who use Skype, that's a peer-produced telephone network. Or if shudder to fear, any of you use peer-to-peer networks, that's also a network environment that's based on the multiplicity of individuals. There's research that goes on in distributed computing under the World Community Grid. You can download a screensaver, and while you're not using your cycles, you can start processing information to help solve malaria crisis in Africa. There's a collaborative sense about this type of innovation. And on the other side, there's development. And in that, I mean human development, not just economic development. And that's based, I would say, and very important to the conversation we just had about privacy, freedom and autonomy, and that being a driving principle and also a fundamental ethical boundary, and equality and non-discrimination. So in the privacy world, there's often talk of a panopticon, which was the idea brought about by Jeremy Bentham in the 17th century to create a prison that all of the prisoners would think that they were being watched at all times. And the panopticon is this idea that you are always being watched, is shorthand for that. Foucault takes this up and actually is motivation for, I think, a whole strand of thinking about privacy. Talks about the disciplinary power of the gaze, the fact that we obey, we conform, we behave in certain ways when we know that we're being watched. This panopticon concept. I think part of what I'd like to convey in this talk is that it's very likely that you're living in one, in your digital world, and that most of your activity to some extent is, if not being watched, has the potential of being watched, is being collected. Many mundane tasks and interactions in total. So an important aspect of how the global internet works is that there's internet intermediaries, internet service providers, social networks, companies in the middle that actually provide, from a data gathering or surveillance point of view, like a checkpoint, a choke point, where information can be collected about everyone. And that's sort of the idea of this black box that this guy reported on. There is a point, there's a physical point. We think of it as a borderless world, but there are some physical points where things can be monitored. So I'll take up what's called the Surveillance Society and Privacy International's work, and some of this extrapolates from work in the Electronic Eye by David Lyon. In terms of what is necessary in order to create surveillance society, what's impacted is the coordination, how social relationships are reshaped when you're being watched. What is it about your associations that gets redefined? What do you reconsider in terms of how and what you say to others? Another aspect is risk management. So we had various levels of, from a public policy point of view, gauging the level of risk of a particular activity or association or what have you, and the extent to which that would balance out security concerns. In terms of privacy, it's not just being left alone in your home, because that's really not where we exist, in a sense, nowadays. It's a socio-technical architecture, you could call it, in STS vocabulary, and it's the context in which our interactions take place. It's the way in which we communicate, the fact that you use one email client over another, and how it goes through the servers, and who has access to it on the way is all part of that. And then there's the notion of power. And in surveillance, the power exists with those who are watching. And a key aspect of surveillance is that it be hidden. So a fundamental assumption of surveillance and intelligence is that if someone knows, then they won't reveal the information that is being sought. And so that's an important underlying principle. It also might sort of lead you in the direction of why some of this intelligence stuff is so creepy and secret and hidden away, because of the fact that if it was known about, it would, from the point of view of the people who want to implement these things, would undermine their purposes. I think what it changes significantly and importantly is burdens of proof in regards to your interaction in society, the presumption of innocence. If you're always being watched, if you're always being monitored, if your communication is being somehow tapped into and stored somewhere, the presumption of innocence gets flipped. So it's just a matter of when a keyword or whatever pops in to your little file, and then based on nothing else, the presumption of innocence is flipped, so that data is initially collected. In terms of a right to due process, the Data Protection Directive has an important provision about the ability to access your data and correct it if it's wrong. That goes away with a hidden, omnipresent surveillance society. Probable cause, the fact that you have to actually have done something to attract the watch and the closer monitoring of the police, and very difficult to try to parse out the distributed self. So I would say that many of you, if any of you have a page on a social network, and have friends, or are twittering on a public feed, or have a blog, or or hold information about you in the bank, or anything. Facts about you are distributed; they're not located in one place. So even if someone wanted to, I mean, they could come and ask you, but you couldn't protect it. It's everywhere. It's in the clouds, is the term of the day. So Echelon is this very controversial international system. For those who don't know about it, this is something that was big news around the end of the 20th century. It's a U.S.-UK. It's formed from a U.S.-UK agreement after World War II, but is basically a shared intelligence network that allows for the surveillance of domestic citizens. So because of the fact that the U.S. cannot spy on its own citizens, as according to the law and the Constitution, that's, of course, as our case against is seeking to prove that's not exactly the case, but that isn't followed. But by having data monitoring centers in the UK, the US could monitor things happening in the UK, and the UK could have a center in the US monitoring stuff happening in the US, and then exchange the data, and then you've got surveillance on your own citizens. You've got information on the people who are working directly. So there are all sorts of things in place. The previous sort of talk was about the safeguards that are intended to be in place, the laws that are intended, and my contention is that this is broken and that it is being violated all the time. So the Echelon system, you could look it up. It's this really spooky thing, and it's connected to this system where just certain types of information make it to Tier 1 nations and Tier 2 nations, which Tier 2 nations included Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and then it extended further. In 2001, the European Parliament issued a damning report about this. It starts off with, just to describe the secrecy of it. The first section is about, does this thing exist? It goes about trying to argue that it does exist. And you could look it up. It's the report on the existence of a global system for the interception of private and commercial communications. It spoke harshly about this system, about the extent to which spying on European citizens otherwise. A cynical point of view would say the diplomatic intelligence reciprocity. They weren't getting enough data. The exchange actually is uneven in terms of what kind of information, the kinds of capacities that the data mining systems the U.S. employs have, and the extent to which that's shared with Europe. It's a cynical view. Another view, a pragmatic one, a technological point of view, at least at the time, was that there's no effective search. So you could record all this stuff, but I mean, how do you make sense of it? How do you know where to start? Where do you look? The needle in the haystack is the metaphor that fits here. And then lastly, and I could call it different things, but given our previous speaker, I would call the last thing stopping us is governance and ethics. So to introduce the EU INDEC project. I learned about this last week. The EU INDEC project is short for, apparently, Intelligent Information System Supporting Observation, Searching, and Detection for Security of Citizens in the Urban Environment. I don't know how they got INDEC out of that, but it may be from the original Polish or Czech. Anyways, INDEC is its short name. And it has the following, purposes to actually develop a platform for analyzing multimedia content, a network-centric system that supports the activities of police officers. This isn't just a database, it's connected to the police. Providing techniques and tools for observation of various mobile objects. Develop a new type of search engine to try to solve that second prong of why I said why not. There's no effective way to search. So if I were to summarize what the point of this project is, even though it sort of seems like this and how it's been reported thus far in the news is the extent to which it's this grand totalitarian surveillance system. Another, sort of minor piece of that, and what it is without any controversy in describing it, is that it's an attempt to search these large databases better. What is important about search? Well, Google tells us that its mission is to organize the world's information. It's been doing a pretty good job, and it's been making quite a bit of money doing that. Part of the point, and I'm trying to identify in terms of the overlap between technology and ethics, the extent to which computers can do what humans do, or humans, and that's, I think, a key piece of it, the context algorithm. So when you search for stuff, it's gotten better and better in your being able to receive the information you want. And it's not just about identifying text, it's about relationships. Link popularity was the big thing that threw Google over the edge. The link universe, what you're connected to, who's pointing to you and with what words, became a relevant part of how you turn up on search engines. And important to point out, with the assumption that politics is, that technology is politics by other means, you embed societal biases, including racial profiling and other types of assumptions people make about the world, are embedded into search criteria and search results. One important point about the fact that computers can't really can't replace humans, and I'm calling this in terms of the capacity for judgment, is the business of search engine optimization. You can pay a company a lot of money to get you higher on Google rankings. Google bombing, this is a great activist sport. Still trying to do it, but the first big instance of it that got reported was some guy got a lot of people to try to write the words miserable failure, and with that create a link to the US president webpage, which at the time was George Bush. So the fact that hundreds of people went along with this and typed in miserable failure and created a hyperlink to the US government webpage gamed the Google system so that if you were to type miserable failure for the search results, the first thing that would come up was the President of the United States, George Bush. So this is just an example of Google bomb, gaming the system, being able to demonstrate the fact that the computer actually can't make judgments, it's simply obeying some instructions and working through an algorithm. So I want to show a video. These are the Indect folks. I'm serious here. These are the Indect folks that released this video on Friday. I don't know what you'll make of it. One thing I hope to get out of this talk is to encourage you to forward this to as many friends as you'd like to. So keep that in mind. You can't see it there, but he's stolen the file that's the index file. A little bit of meta filmmaking here.
By observation data that supports biometric threat assessment.
That's the index file that they recovered. Okay, so this was important to note, a video not from people criticizing the project. It's from the researchers themselves, and this is the first video they've released. You'll see that when I searched for it, there were 956 views. I've been sending it around. If you could help up that number so that people could actually see this project, I think that would be important. So in terms of the project partners, as was identified before, they're from all across Europe. They're not just universities. This is available on the website indect-project.eu. But they're from all over, from Poland, Czech Republic, Germany, UK, France, etc. It's police departments, it's research institutes, etc., all working together. So on Sunday, this Sunday, there was a leak. It went up on wikileaks.org. If you're not familiar with the site, it's a great place to find stuff that just makes its way onto the internet. There was a leak of one of the reports from York University. It's not that sexy a report, but it's an example of the kind of research, and they're doing high-level research on search and the ability to take multimedia content and be able to search semantically more efficiently for that. It also proposed, and I think is a problem for if this is part of the system, the watermarking of digital content as a necessity. So I've been trying to read more about what Ben Hayes has described as the EU Security Industrial Complex, a paper that was released in May from Statewatch. The Neocon Opticon is worth reading. It tries to trace the funding for some of these kinds of projects, and significant for this theme of these sets of talks. It's an inward-facing migration control idea, in that some of the surveillance of those in other countries who are trying to migrate is turning inwards, so that you look at who the illegal immigrants are within your country. I think it's a key distinction in terms of that. So, what does the role of ethics and technology have to do with it? Well, technological design is political. I think a privacy impact assessment and data protection analysis is missing from this project and needs to be done. It turns out that we have right here an idea about how to do that. Just to emphasize that that technology is in some ways can be neutral in the sense now is being discussed more and more, network neutrality and the ability for the system to be sort of dumb and actually connect people one-to-one, end-to-end principle. The fact that it's an open architecture that doesn't have someone controlling, or modifying, or shaping in the middle, and that in other senses, the way that technology is implemented and those who have control and those who have access to the information exercise a disproportionate amount of power, and they're relying on computers to make judgments, and the algorithms that are going into those are problematic from the point of view of ethics. I think, especially if the tone. I wouldn't be alarmist if it wasn't also the tone of the way that this project seems to present itself. So with that, I thank you for your attention and time, and hope that I haven't scared you, and hope that I've motivated you to do something about it. I have a small suggestion, which is just forwarding the video with a note saying, have you heard about this? What do you think about it? Does that seem like a world you want to live in? If you could send that around to a few people, I think that would be that would help preserve an open society in a small way. Thank you.
Thanks, Eddan. Are there any questions or reactions or comments?
What I found very alarming, if I understood your talk correctly, is that for the moment, in a lot of people, the only thing that blocks them still in having the security issues are technical. If they can overcome this, it can be implemented. Ethics, some might have. So that for me is very alarming. And if I hear you ask us to distribute this, the arms we have to fight against this is distributing information and hoping people will see the same thing in it. Because I don't know if the European Commission can do something more with the data protection agencies, a data protection supervisor, if we have more means to protect ourselves than just distribute things like this, which have become visual, or if it's just lingering underground, feeding on a sense of insecurity people have, or some people, because they have lived through terrorist attacks, etc.
Yeah, no, I think on the first point, I think it is a matter of governance and ethics as the only thing left. I mentioned politics, technology, and then ethics and governance. In terms of the politics, I think that the increased data exchange agreements with the US that the EU is engaging in that were mentioned in terms of visa information and passenger name records for airplanes indicate a greater cooperation and sending back and forth. So check that off. In terms of the technology, I mean, these things aren't really, you read the paper and it goes onto an IRC chat trying to track some hooligans. They actually have done research on real data of people that is not being used for the purposes intended. It's still crude, but it's just a matter of improving algorithms. And to some extent, I think these will be employed, and they'll be employed imperfectly, and the imperfection is actually what is most concerning about civil liberties. But finally, in regards to, secondly, in regards to what you're saying about what you can do, well, so my organization is funded by members. We have over 13,000 members, and mostly we also have some funding for the sake of transparency from foundations, and have had small limited grants from corporations, but primarily large majority from members. And people actually are empowered much more so in the digital age to do something than they were, and something as simple as forwarding this and bringing sunlight onto it, having more people aware of it, is, I think, is actually an important step. On a pragmatic level, it demonstrates to politicians that this is an issue that people care about, that they're willing to, that would be popular for them to support doing something about it. There are, other mechanisms that sort of learn and discover in terms of the Article 29 working group, in terms of the data protection supervisor. There are mechanisms within the European Union system to try to balance out these things and correct them. And it's just a matter of making sure that that's done. Unfortunately, the essay I pointed, the Neocon-Opticon, the security industrial complex, indicates to me that that even chopping some projects off at the knees is not going to do anything about the larger move towards total surveillance that's taking place. Okay. There are things that you can do more than that, but you can start by forwarding this around to friends. I'm also part of the European Digital Rights Initiative, which is an umbrella group of digital rights groups in all the countries of Europe. Joining one of those groups or going to a meeting or checking out their website is another way they're concerned about these issues as well.
Too bad when you left, it would have been interesting to get a commission input, but maybe that's why.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Comments, reactions?
As a part of the cost in this, what do you think about
No, I mean,
that's why it's still
I guess it wasn't one of the slides. It's like it started in recently. I think in January the funds are distributed, upwards of 17 million. It's supposed to go on for 60 months. It's already started. From what I understood from the talk before me, it should have gone under the review of that governance and ethics division, if I understood that correctly. It apparently did not, or did and was not a thorough review. So I think that European Parliament, there are mechanisms through which European Parliament members can work in a coalition together to, bring about a declaration, a study, or whatever. So if you feel like contacting your MEP about it, that's a good idea too.
Any other questions?
Thanks very much.
Yeah, well, thanks very much.
Appreciate your time. I know it's late.
And for your interesting putting it in context of the first presentation we heard. Let me just advertise the next installment of the lecture series, which will take place a week from now on the 14th of October. And it will be on Eurosur, the ethical and legal challenges of European border control systems. So we're moving from the virtual space to something a bit more concrete, and I hope that many of you will join us next week as well. Thanks very much, and thank you for coming.